Today we have 4 stories for you, and one of them is a horror story with an ending that's going to catch you completely off guard. But before we get into it, if you're someone who's into intriguing true stories, then you're in the right place. So make sure to hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment down below. Welcome to Stories by Jaja. Let's get into it. The woman in room 434. On the afternoon of February 9th, 2012, a 48-year-old woman walked into the lobby of the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Beverly Hills, California, and she walked up to the front desk and she asked to be checked in. And the guy at the front desk, he pulls up her reservation and he looks at his screen and he sees that the name on the reservation is Elizabeth Collins. And so he asks the woman to sign in as Elizabeth Collins, and she signs in as Elizabeth Collins, and he hands her the keys to a suite on the 4th floor, room 434. And so this woman, quote unquote Elizabeth Collins, goes up to room 434 and she gets settled in. And for the next 2 days, she basically just stays in that room, coming and going with a small entourage of people around her. She had a personal assistant with her, she had a hairstylist with her, and she had a bodyguard, a really big guy, who literally stood outside the door of room 434, basically 24 hours a day. And the whole time she was checked in at that hotel, not a single person at the front desk, not a single housekeeper, not a single guest walking through the lobby had any idea that the woman up in room 434 was actually not Elizabeth Collins. Elizabeth Collins was actually the name of her grandmother, and she was using her grandmother's name to check into that hotel, because if she had used her real name, within about 5 minutes, the entire building would have been swarmed by paparazzi and fans and news vans. And she really did not want that because she was in Beverly Hills for a very specific reason. That Sunday, February 12th, was the Grammy Awards. And every single year, the night before the Grammy Awards, one of the biggest music executives in the entire world, a man named Clive Davis, threw a massive party at the Beverly Hilton right there in the ballroom on the ground floor. And this party was one of the most exclusive parties in Hollywood. Basically, every major music artist, every actor, every producer would show up to this thing. And this woman up in room 434 had been coming to that party every single year for almost 30 years. Because Clive Davis was not just her friend, he was actually the guy who had discovered her when she was a teenager. And he had personally signed her to her first record deal. And she was also scheduled to perform at the party that year, so she was staying at the hotel to be close to the action. The party was on Saturday, February 11th, which was in 2 days. But to really understand how this woman ended up alone in room 434 that weekend, you have to go all the way back to 1963. In August of 1963, in Newark, New Jersey, a woman named Whitney Houston, who at the time was a working gospel singer, gave birth to a baby girl, and she and her husband named the baby girl Whitney Elizabeth. And from the time Whitney was really little, her mother would take her to a church in East Orange, New Jersey, called the New Hope Baptist Church, and Whitney would sing in the junior choir. And by the time Whitney was about 11 years old, she could stand up in front of the entire congregation and sing a hymn all by herself and just totally silence the room. She had this huge, powerful adult voice coming out of an 11-year-old kid. And everybody in that church knew right away that this girl was going to be somebody. But Whitney did not really think about becoming a singer for a very long time, because in her house, singing was just what everybody did. Her mother was a professional singer. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick, who was already a huge star at the time. And Aretha Franklin was a family friend that Whitney called Aunt Ree. So being a singer to Whitney was just kind of a normal adult job. And so instead, she spent most of her teenage years modeling. She was on the cover of 17 magazine when she was 17 years old, and she was one of the first black women ever to be on the cover of that magazine. But at night, while she was doing all this modeling stuff during the day, her mother would drag her along to nightclubs around New York City, where her mother was booked as the headliner, and Whitney would come along and sing backup. And so Whitney, even though she was really young, was getting real live performance experience singing in front of paying audiences in Manhattan basically every single night. And one of these clubs was called Sweetwater's, and it was on Amsterdam Avenue, right around 68th Street. And so in 1983, when Whitney was 19 years old, she was up on the stage at Sweetwater's singing backup, when at one point during the show, her mother stepped aside and let Whitney take the mic and do a solo. And Whitney sang a song called Home from the Broadway musical The Wiz. And then she sang a song called The Greatest Love of All. And what Whitney did not know was that sitting in the audience that night was Clive Davis. And Clive had actually not come to the club by accident. His A&R guy, a man named Jerry Griffith, had been tipping him off for weeks that there was this teenage girl singing backup for Whitney Houston who had this insane voice, and Clive needed to come see for himself. And so Clive shows up, and he sits there in the audience, and he watches this 19-year-old girl step up to the mic, and she starts singing. And Clive Davis, who had personally discovered and signed people like Bruce Springsteen and Janis Joplin and Aerosmith, later said in interviews that he was totally shocked because he had never in his life heard a voice like that coming out of a teenager. And so he went backstage after the show, and right there on the spot, he told Whitney that he wanted to sign her to Arista Records. And so a few weeks later, in April of 1983, Whitney signed her first record deal. And just like that, Whitney Houston's career had started. 2 years later, her debut album came out. It was just called Whitney Houston, and it sold over 25 million copies worldwide and became one of the best-selling debut albums by any artist in history. 2 years after that, her second album came out, and it also sold like 20 million copies. And then in 1992, she starred in her first movie, which was called The Bodyguard. And the soundtrack from that movie included her cover of a song called I Will Always Love You, which went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 14 straight weeks. And to this day, that song is still one of the best-selling singles in the entire history of recorded music. Whitney won 6 Grammys, she got nominated for 25 more, she sold over 200 million records worldwide, and pretty much everywhere she went in the world, people basically treated her like royalty. But right around this same time, in July of 1992, so just a few months before The Bodyguard came out, Whitney married a guy named Bobby Brown. Bobby was also a very famous singer at the time. He had come out of an R&B group called New Edition, and he had a huge solo career of his own. But Bobby also had a reputation for being kind of a wild guy. He had been arrested a few times, he was known to use drugs, and a lot of the people around Whitney, including her family and Clive Davis, were not happy about this marriage because they felt like Bobby was going to drag Whitney down. But Whitney was in love, and she married him anyway. And then in March of 1993, so about 8 months after they got married, Whitney and Bobby had a daughter, and they named her Bobby Christina. And for a while, things seemed okay. Whitney was still releasing hit music, she was still making movies, she was still winning awards. But behind the scenes, something was going very wrong. Whitney had actually started using drugs, and she had been using drugs on and off for years, going all the way back to the 1980s. But now, in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, her drug use started getting worse, and it started to affect her voice, which is really the one thing you cannot afford to lose when you are Whitney Houston. And so throughout the 2000s, Whitney's career started to fall apart. Her albums stopped selling the way they used to sell. She would show up to interviews and concerts looking really thin and sick. In 2002, she did this famous interview with Diane Sawyer where she basically admitted that she had been using drugs. And she said this line that people still quote to this day. She said, quote, "The biggest devil is me. I'm either my best friend or my worst enemy." And then in 2007, Whitney and Bobby Brown got divorced. And Whitney went to rehab a couple of times, and she came out and she said she was clean, and everybody was rooting for her comeback. And by early 2012, it really did seem like Whitney was making a comeback. She had just finished filming a new movie called Sparkle, she had been working on new music, and Clive Davis had invited her to perform at his pre-Grammy party, which brings us back to the Beverly Hilton and room 434. On the morning of Saturday, February 11th, 2012, Whitney woke up in room 434, and she was in a really good mood. She was talking to her hairstylist, a woman named Tiffany Dixon, about what she was going to wear that night, and about her hair, and about how the party was going to go. Whitney complained a little bit about having a sore throat, but other than that, she seemed really happy. And then at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Whitney's personal assistant, a woman named Mary Jones, suggested to Whitney that she take a bath to relax before the party, and Mary said she needed to run down the street to the Neiman Marcus to pick up a dress. And so Whitney said, okay, she would take a bath, and Mary would go grab the dress and come right back. And so at 3 p.m., Mary walked out of the hotel room, and standing right outside in the hallway was Whitney's longtime bodyguard, a man named Ray Watson, and Ray stayed at his post outside the door while Mary went to run her errand. And then 35 minutes later, at 3:35 p.m., Mary came back to room 434. She opened the door, she walked inside, she called out for Whitney, and Whitney did not answer. And so Mary walked toward the bathroom, and when she got there and she looked inside, she saw Whitney lying face down in the bathtub, submerged under about a foot of water. And Mary started screaming, and Ray Watson came running in from the hallway, and the two of them pulled Whitney out of the water, and they started doing CPR, and someone called 911. Paramedics from the Beverly Hills Fire Department got to the room at 3:43 p.m., and they did CPR on Whitney for about 20 more minutes, and then at 3:55 p.m. they stopped, because there was nothing else they could do. Whitney was gone. She was 48 years old. And meanwhile, down in the ballroom of that same hotel, Clive Davis's pre-Grammy party was literally starting to happen. Celebrities were walking in, photographers were snapping pictures, and none of them had any idea that upstairs on the 4th floor, in room 434, the woman that party was basically being thrown for was lying dead on the bathroom floor. Clive Davis actually made the decision to go ahead with the party that night out of respect for Whitney, because he said that's what she would have wanted. And he stood up at the beginning of the party, and he told the crowd what had happened. And a lot of the people in the room were just completely in shock. When investigators went into room 434, they found a small spoon with a white crystal-like substance on it sitting on the bathroom counter. They found a small mirror inside of a drawer with a white powdery substance on it. And they found about a dozen bottles of prescription medications scattered around the room. A few weeks later, the Los Angeles County coroner released the official autopsy report, and it said that Whitney's cause of death was accidental drowning, and that heart disease and cocaine use were listed as contributing factors. Whitney had cocaine in her system, along with marijuana, Xanax, a muscle relaxant called Flexeril, and Benadryl. And the coroner determined that Whitney had probably used cocaine right before she got into the bathtub. And the cocaine, combined with a heart condition she did not even know she had, basically caused her to have a cardiac event, and she slipped under the water and drowned. And the world had basically just lost one of the greatest singers who'd ever lived. But the story does not end there. Because remember, when Whitney died in that bathtub in room 434 on February 11th, 2012, she left behind a daughter, Bobby Christina, who at the time was 18 years old. And Bobby Christina, who everyone in the family just called Chrissy, had basically grown up in the middle of all of the chaos that was Whitney and Bobby Brown's marriage. She had seen the drug use, she had seen the fighting, she had grown up around all of it. And by the time Whitney died, Chrissy had already started using drugs herself. After her mother's funeral, Chrissy moved into a townhouse in a suburb of Atlanta called Roswell, Georgia, and she was living there with her boyfriend at the time, a guy named Nick Gordon, who Whitney had actually raised as her own son when he was a kid. And things inside that townhouse were not good. There were reports of drug use, there were reports of fighting, and Chrissy was really struggling to deal with the loss of her mother. And then on the morning of January 31st, 2015, Nick Gordon and a friend of theirs named Max Lomas were inside of that townhouse in Roswell. And at some point that morning, one of them walked into the bathroom and they found Chrissy lying face down in the bathtub, submerged in water, and she was not breathing. And they pulled her out and they started doing CPR, and paramedics rushed her to North Fulton Hospital and then eventually to Emory Hospital in Atlanta. But by the time she got to the hospital, she had already been without oxygen for too long, and she had suffered permanent brain damage. And Chrissy never woke up. She stayed in a coma for almost 6 months, and eventually she was transferred to a hospice facility called Peachtree Christian Hospice in Duluth, Georgia. And on July 26, 2015, Bobby Christina Brown died. She was 22 years old. And when the autopsy report finally came out, it said that Chrissy's cause of death was the immersion of her face in water combined with a mixture of drugs, and the drugs found in her system were marijuana, alcohol, a cocaine-related substance called benzoylecgonine, benzodiazepines, and morphine, which is a list of drugs that is almost identical to the list of drugs that had been found in her mother's body 3 years earlier. Bobby Christina was found face down in a bathtub on January 31st, 2015. Her mother, Whitney, had been found face down in a bathtub on February 11th, 2012, which means that these two women, a mother and a daughter, both died in almost exactly the same way, in almost exactly the same position, from almost exactly the same combination of drugs and water, less than 3 years apart to the day. And to this day, nobody has ever been able to fully explain how that could possibly happen. The Houston family buried Bobby Christina right next to her mother in Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey. And that is where the two of them lie today, side by side. At 5 o'clock in the late 1970s, on the western end of Long Island, New York, a man in his early 30s was sitting inside of a small radio broadcasting facility. And he was doing his job, because this guy was an electrical engineer. And he had a specialization in something called radio frequency work, which is basically the science of understanding radio waves and how they travel through the air. And on this particular day, this engineer was calibrating some very sensitive equipment that was used to detect and measure radio signals in the atmosphere. And around 5 p.m. in the afternoon, he was looking at his equipment, and he noticed that his readings were doing something completely bizarre, because at exactly 5 p.m., a giant, powerful, unexplained radio signal blasted through his equipment, and it kind of knocked everything out of calibration. And this engineer was confused because there was no radio station in the area that was supposed to be broadcasting at that frequency. But he kind of shrugged it off, and he recalibrated his equipment, and he went home for the day. But then the next day, he was in the studio doing his same job again, and at exactly 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the exact same giant unexplained radio signal came in and knocked out his equipment. And then the same thing happened again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every single day, at exactly 5 p.m., for weeks in a row, this unexplained signal would come blasting into his equipment for a few minutes, and then it would just disappear again. And this engineer, who was really into radio waves and understood how they worked better than pretty much anybody, could not figure out what this signal was or where it was coming from, because it was too powerful and too consistent to be a natural phenomenon, and it was not coming from any known radio station. And so this engineer decided he was going to figure out where the signal was coming from. And so he built a special kind of directional antenna, which is basically an antenna that can tell you which direction a radio signal is coming from. And he took his directional antenna out, and he pointed it around, and he tracked the signal. And the signal was coming from the east. And so he got in his car, and he drove east, and he took readings. And then he drove further east, and he took more readings. And he kept driving further and further east across Long Island, following the signal. And Long Island is a long, thin island, and it stretches for about 120 miles from New York City all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean. And this engineer kept driving east, mile after mile, deeper and deeper into the eastern half of the island, taking readings the whole time. And eventually the signal led him all the way to the eastern tip of Long Island, to a tiny fishing village called Montauk. And in Montauk, at the very last point of land before the ocean, was a decommissioned old military base called Camp Hero. And this engineer stood outside of the fence of Camp Hero with his directional antenna, and he confirmed it. This giant, powerful, unexplained radio signal that was coming into Long Island every single day at exactly 5 p.m. in the afternoon was coming from inside of Camp Hero. But Camp Hero, according to the United States government, had been shut down. There was not supposed to be anybody inside of it. But to really understand what this engineer had just discovered, and how it would ultimately unravel one of the strangest conspiracy theories in American history, you have to go all the way back to World War II. In 1942, in the middle of World War II, the United States Army was worried that German submarines called U-boats were going to sneak up onto the east coast of America, and they might even try to attack New York City. And so the Army built a coastal defense base at the far eastern tip of Long Island, right on the ocean, and they called it Camp Hero. And Camp Hero had these huge coastal artillery guns pointed out at the water. But the really strange thing about Camp Hero, right from the very beginning, was that the entire base was designed to be disguised. From above, from the air, if a German plane flew over Camp Hero, the base was designed to look like a small, sleepy, coastal New England fishing village. The Army had actually gone to the trouble of building fake wooden houses on the base. They had built a fake church steeple. They had built fake little village storefronts so that any enemy plane looking down from above would just see a peaceful little town, and they would fly right past it, and they would have no idea that there were huge military guns hidden underneath. And this was really unusual, even by military standards, because most military bases do not go this far to look like something they are not. But at Camp Hero, from the very beginning, the whole point of the place was that nobody was supposed to know what was really going on inside of it. And after World War II ended, the Cold War started. And Camp Hero was converted from a coastal defense base into a radar station, and the United States Air Force took it over. And they built a giant radar tower on the base that could look thousands of miles out into the atmosphere to try to detect Soviet bombers coming in over the North Pole. This radar tower was called the ANFPS-35, and it was one of the biggest radar antennas ever built. The antenna itself was about 8 stories tall, and it weighed about 40 tons. And it is actually still standing on top of the base to this day. And then in 1981, the Air Force officially decommissioned Camp Hero. They said the radar technology was outdated, and they did not need the base anymore, and they closed it down, and the entire base was supposed to be totally empty. Which is why the engineer, standing outside of the fence in the late 1970s with his directional antenna, could not figure out how this signal was coming from inside a shut-down military base. But this engineer did not do anything about it right away. He just kind of took his readings, and then he went home. And then a few years passed. And then in 1984, 3 years after the base had officially been shut down for good, this engineer went back to Montauk. And this time, he actually decided to go inside of Camp Hero. He wanted to see what was in there. And so he hiked through the woods around the base, and he found a spot where the fence was down, and he snuck inside. And when he got inside, what he saw kind of took his breath away, because it was almost like the entire base had been evacuated in a hurry. There were doors left wide open, and the doors were kind of banging in the wind. There was scientific equipment left sitting on desks, half assembled. There were half-drunk cups of coffee that had grown mold. There were papers with what looked like classified research on them, still just lying around on the floor, kind of shuffling in the breeze coming through the open doors. And whoever had been working at Camp Hero, which according to the United States government was supposed to be totally empty, had left in such a rush that they had not even bothered to clean anything up. It looked, according to Nichols, like everybody who had been inside had just heard a fire alarm go off and had gotten up and run out the door and had never come back. And as this engineer walked deeper and deeper into the base, he started to feel really strange because certain hallways and certain rooms seemed familiar to him. Like he had been down these hallways before, even though he was pretty sure he had never been inside of the base in his life. And he started to feel like he had been inside of these buildings before. And he even knew which room was going to be around each corner before he got there. And then, all of a sudden, he started having these flashes in his mind. Kind of like memories that he had never known he had. Memories of being at Camp Hero, wearing a lab coat, working with other scientists on some kind of massive secret research project. And these were vivid, real memories, not just kind of vague images. He could remember the faces of the other people he had worked with. He could remember conversations they had had. And this engineer, at this point in his life, in 1984, was 38 years old, and he could not explain any of these memories, because as far as he knew, he had never in his entire life worked at Camp Hero. And this engineer, whose name was Preston Nichols, went home to Long Island that day, and over the next several years, he tried to piece together what he had seen and what he had remembered. And in 1992, he sat down and he wrote a book about it. And the book was called The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time. And what Preston Nichols said in that book is that between 1971 and 1983, the United States government had run one of the most secret and most disturbing and most bizarre research projects in the entire history of the United States in the underground levels of Camp Hero. And Preston Nichols himself claimed that he had been one of the scientists who had worked on the project, but that when the project had ended, his memories of ever having been there had been surgically wiped from his mind. And the story Preston Nichols told in this book was insane. Because according to Nichols, the project at Camp Hero had started as a study of psychological warfare. The scientists there were basically trying to figure out how to use radio waves to control human minds. And that was the giant radio signal that Nichols had detected on his equipment in the 1970s. It was the Camp Hero scientists broadcasting an experimental mind control frequency across Long Island every day at exactly 5 p.m. But according to Nichols, the mind control experiments were just the beginning. Because at some point during their research, the scientists at Camp Hero built a chair. They called it the Montauk chair. And the chair was designed to be sat in by a person who had strong natural psychic abilities. And when this person sat in the chair, the machines connected to the chair would amplify their psychic powers to a level that had never been seen before. And with these amplified powers, the person in the chair could, according to Nichols, do things that basically sound impossible. They could read the minds of other people from across the country. They could manifest physical objects out of thin air. And most disturbingly, they could open up portals in time and travel to different eras. And according to Nichols, the man who could do all of these things while sitting in the Montauk chair was a guy named Duncan Cameron. And there is a whole other, even weirder subplot to the Montauk Project story that involves Duncan Cameron. Because Duncan Cameron and his brother Ed Cameron were connected to another alleged secret government experiment from decades earlier, called the Philadelphia experiment. Because in October of 1943, so during World War II, the United States Navy had allegedly experimented with the USS Eldridge, which was a real destroyer escort ship, and they had allegedly tried to make the ship invisible to radar using powerful electromagnetic generators. But according to the conspiracy theory, when they turned the generators on, the ship did not just become invisible to radar. It disappeared from Philadelphia entirely, and it teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, hundreds of miles away, and then teleported back again. And when it came back, some of the sailors on board were fused into the walls of the ship. And two of the sailors, Duncan Cameron and Ed Cameron, allegedly jumped off of the ship in the middle of the teleportation. And instead of falling into the water in 1943, they fell through time itself, and they landed at Camp Hero in the year 1983, where the scientists were expecting them. Now, if all of this sounds completely insane, that is because it is. And there is basically no verifiable proof for any of it. But Preston Nichols was not done, because in his book, he then made an accusation that was even darker than everything else he had claimed. Because Nichols alleged that in order to find kids with strong psychic potential for their experiments, the scientists at Camp Hero were actually abducting teenage runaways from all over the Northeast. Kids who nobody would notice were missing. And these kids, who Nichols called the Montauk Boys, were allegedly trained and used and experimented on inside of the base for years. And according to Nichols, the entire project came to an end on a single day, on August 12th, 1983. Because on that day, the scientists put Duncan Cameron in the Montauk chair one final time, and they turned everything on. But something went wrong. Because Duncan Cameron, sitting in the chair, accidentally used his amplified psychic powers to manifest a giant creature that started rampaging through the underground levels of the base. And the scientists panicked, and they grabbed a fire axe, and they smashed all of the equipment, and every single person who worked at Camp Hero fled the base. And whatever it was that Duncan had summoned was left down there in the dark. And that, Nichols claimed, was why, when he had walked into Camp Hero in 1984, the base had looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. And every one of these claims, from the mind control to the time travel to the Montauk Boys to the creature, has been completely denied by the United States government. The government says the base was a radar station and nothing more. There is no verified, tangible proof for any of the specific things that Preston Nichols alleged happened there. And a lot of researchers think Nichols made most of it up. But here is the eerie part. Because Camp Hero, since being decommissioned, has been converted into a state park called Camp Hero State Park. And every single year, thousands of visitors go to Camp Hero to hike through the forest and to look at the abandoned buildings. And what those visitors keep reporting over and over again is really strange stuff. They report electronic equipment inside of the park cutting out for no reason at random moments. They report finding graffiti spray painted onto the walls of the abandoned bunkers in a child's handwriting that reads, quote, "Stranger help me." They report finding old doors that lead down into underground stairwells that have been sealed shut with concrete. And most strangely, the giant ANFPS-35 radar tower, That big antenna up on the top of the base that was decommissioned decades ago and that has not had power running to it since 1981 has repeatedly been reported by visitors to actually rotate on its own, which is not supposed to be possible because the antenna is not connected to any power source. And in 2016, a TV writer named Ross Duffer and his brother Matt Duffer, who had heard about the Montauk Project story their entire lives, decided to write a TV show based on it. And they called their show Montauk. And the show was about a government facility on the East Coast where scientists were experimenting on kids with psychic abilities, and one of those kids accidentally opened a portal to another dimension and let a monster out. But at some point during production, the Duffer Brothers changed the name of their show. They moved the fictional setting from Long Island to Indiana, and they released the show on Netflix under a new name, Stranger Things. And Stranger Things went on to become one of the most successful streaming shows in the history of television. And Preston Nichols, the electrical engineer who had picked up the strange signal on his radio equipment back in the 1970s, and who had walked into the abandoned base in 1984 and started having memories of things he had never done, passed away in 2018 at the age of 72. And he insisted, all the way up until the day he died, that every single thing he had written in his book was completely true. But the government still denies it. And Camp Hero is still standing. And the radar tower up on top of the base still, according to visitors who go there, sometimes rotates all on its own. And every once in a while, somebody driving through Montauk with the radio on at exactly 5 p.m. in the afternoon still reports that for just a couple of minutes, their signal cuts out completely, and all they can hear is static. On the afternoon of June 29, 1978, a 32-year-old actress named Victoria Ann Berry was driving through the streets of Scottsdale, Arizona, and eventually she pulled into the parking lot of an apartment complex called the Winfield Place Apartments. And she was going there to check on a friend of hers, an older guy in his late 40s, who she had been co-starring with in a play at a local dinner theater. Because that morning, this guy was supposed to meet Victoria for lunch, and he had never shown up. And Victoria had been trying to reach him all morning, but he was not answering his phone. And so she just drove over to his apartment to see if he was okay. And when she got to the parking lot, she walked up to Unit 132A on the first floor, and she knocked on the door, and there was no answer. And so she just tried the handle, and to her surprise, the door was unlocked. And so she pushed it open, and she stepped inside. And basically, the moment she stepped inside that apartment, she noticed something was very, very wrong. Because when she looked around, she could see that the walls were covered in what looked like dried blood. There was blood spatter on the ceiling, was blood on the carpet, and there was blood on the doorframe. And Victoria kind of froze up. And then she slowly walked further into the apartment, and she peered around the corner into the bedroom. And there on the bed, she saw her friend and co-star lying on his side, and he had been beaten to death. And there was an electrical cord tied in a bow around his neck, and he had been dead for hours. And Victoria basically ran out of the apartment screaming, and she called the police. And within minutes, the parking lot of the Winfield Place Apartments was swarmed by Scottsdale police officers. And when the police walked into Unit 132A and they saw what was inside, they were completely shocked. Because this was not just some random guy who had been murdered in his sleep. This was one of the most famous television actors in America. But to really understand how this guy had ended up dead in an apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the summer of 1978, you have to go all the way back to 1928. In July of 1928, in Waterbury, Connecticut, a woman named Rose gave birth to a baby boy, and she and her husband, a guy named Alfred, named the baby Robert Edward. But from the time he was little, everybody just called him Bob. And Bob grew up mostly in a town called Stamford, Connecticut. And from the time he was really little, he was obsessed with music. And when Bob was 11 years old, he picked up a pair of drumsticks for the first time, and pretty much right away, he was a natural. And by the time he was in high school, Bob was actually good enough on the drums that he was performing with real professional bands around Connecticut. And he thought for a while that he was going to be a professional drummer. But at some point in his early 20s, he kind of pivoted and he started working in radio. And it turned out Bob was also a natural at radio. He had this really smooth, deep, funny voice, and he had this quick, sharp wit, and he was really likable on the mic. And so Bob started out working at small radio stations in New York and Connecticut, but then in 1956, he got a huge job offer. He got hired at a big radio station in Los Angeles called KNX, which was a CBS station. And Bob moved out to LA, and he took over the morning drive time show. And within a couple of years, Bob's morning show was the #1 rated morning radio show in all of Los Angeles. And because he was so popular, huge celebrities started showing up on his show as guests. People like Marilyn Monroe and Bob Hope, and even a future president of the United States named Ronald Reagan. And basically, the executives over at CBS were watching all of this, and they saw that Bob was this really funny, charming, good-looking guy who could hold his own with any celebrity in Hollywood, and they thought, we need to put this guy on television. And so they started giving Bob small guest roles on their comedy shows, kind of testing him out. And then in 1965, CBS offered Bob the lead role in a brand new sitcom that they were about to launch. It was a really strange idea for a sitcom. It was a comedy that was set inside of a German prisoner of war camp during World War II. And Bob would play the lead character, an American colonel named Robert Hogan, who was the leader of the American prisoners. The show was called Hogan's Heroes. And Bob signed on, and the show premiered in the fall of 1965. And Hogan's Heroes became a massive hit. It ran for 6 seasons, from 1965 all the way to 1971. Bob was nominated for 2 Emmys for his role as Colonel Hogan. He became one of the most recognizable faces on American television. And his name, Bob Crane, was in every entertainment magazine in the country. He had a wife, he had kids, he had a big house in California, he was making really good money, and from the outside, it basically looked like Bob Crane had it all. But behind the scenes, Bob had a secret. Because from pretty early on in his career, Bob had developed this strange, obsessive hobby, which was that he was completely obsessed with photographing and recording women that he was sleeping with. He had thousands of photographs. He had huge scrapbooks. And when consumer video equipment started coming out in the 1960s and 70s, Bob got into that too. He would set up cameras in his hotel rooms and in his houses and film his encounters with women, and then he would keep the tapes and label them and store them in his collection. And in the middle of Hogan's Heroes, sometime in the late 1960s, one of Bob's co-stars on the show, a British actor named Richard Dawson, who a lot of people might know from later hosting the game show Family Feud, introduced Bob to a friend of his. This friend was a guy named John Henry Carpenter. And John Carpenter was a Sony Electronics sales manager who worked out of Los Angeles. And because he worked for Sony, he had access to the newest, most advanced consumer video equipment on Earth. Stuff that regular people basically could not get their hands on. And when Bob and John met and John found out about Bob's obsession with recording his encounters, the two of them clicked immediately. And they became best friends. And for the next roughly 10 years, Bob and John basically had this secret arrangement. John would provide Bob with the top-of-the-line video equipment, and Bob, because he was a famous television actor, would attract women in bars and nightclubs. And the two of them together would go on this kind of hunt basically every single night. John Carpenter was also so committed to this arrangement that he would actually schedule his Sony sales trips around Bob's schedule, so that no matter where Bob was in the country, John would find a way to be in the same city. But then in 1971, Hogan's Heroes was canceled. And after the show ended, Bob's career basically fell off a cliff. He tried to launch a new sitcom that failed. He tried to do movies that also did not really work. And by the mid-1970s, Bob was reduced to doing dinner theater, which is basically these small live theater productions performed in restaurants and hotel ballrooms in smaller cities all across the country. And Bob would tour with these plays for weeks at a time, going from city to city and staying in furnished corporate apartments. But even as Bob's career was falling apart, his friendship with John Carpenter and their nightly routine just kept going. And then in June of 1978, Bob went on tour with a play called Beginner's Luck, and one of the stops on the tour was at a place called the Windmill Dinner Theater in Scottsdale, Arizona. And Bob checked into a furnished apartment at the Winfield Place Apartments, Unit 132A. And when he got there, he called up John Carpenter, and John flew out from Los Angeles to Scottsdale to spend time with him, just like he always did. But something was different this time, because when Bob had turned 49 years old the previous year, he had kind of had this realization that he was almost 50 and he was doing dinner theater in Arizona, and his career was in shambles, and he wanted to change his life. And Bob had actually confided in his son Robert that he was planning to divorce his wife Patty, and he wanted to basically clean house of the people around him. And one of the people he wanted to cut out of his life was John Carpenter, because he felt like John had become a bad influence on him. And so on the night of June 28th, 1978, Bob and John went out to a nightclub in Scottsdale together, and at some point in that nightclub, they got into a huge fight. There were witnesses at the club who later told police that Bob and John had a really heated argument that night, and John left the club. And Bob, according to phone records, actually called John later that night and basically told him their friendship was over. And Bob went back to his apartment at the Winfield Place Apartments and went to bed. And sometime in the early morning hours of June 29th, 1978, somebody let themselves into Unit 132A because there was no sign of forced entry. And they walked into Bob Crane's bedroom while he was sleeping, and they picked up a heavy object, which the police later believed was a camera tripod, and they hit Bob Crane in the head with it twice and killed him. And then this person tied an electrical video cord in a bow around Bob's neck, almost like a signature. And then they walked out of the apartment and they disappeared. And later that afternoon, Bob's co-star Victoria Ann Barry drove over to check on him. And that is when she found what was inside of Unit 132A. Now, the Scottsdale police, from basically the first day of the investigation, believed that they knew who had killed Bob Crane. And it was John Henry Carpenter. Because he had the motive, which was that Bob had just cut him out of his life. He had the opportunity because he was in Scottsdale and had been with Bob the night before. And the police even found a small smear of blood inside of the rental car that John Carpenter had been driving in Scottsdale, that they believed had come from Bob Crane. But there was a huge problem because when they tested that blood, this was 1978 and DNA testing basically did not exist yet. And the sample was too small and too degraded to definitively prove anything. And so the case sat unsolved for years. And then in 1990, so 12 years after the murder, a Scottsdale investigator named Barry Vassall and a Maricopa County investigator named Jim Raines reopened the case. And they went back through all of the old crime scene photos. And they found a photo that had been taken of the inside of John Carpenter's rental car back in 1978. And in that photo, in the trunk of the rental car, they could see what appeared to be a small piece of biological tissue that they believed might be brain tissue from Bob Crane. And based on this photo and the other circumstantial evidence, a judge ruled that there was enough to reopen the case. And so in 1992, John Henry Carpenter was arrested and charged with the murder of Bob Crane. And in 1994, John Carpenter went to trial. And during the trial, Bob Crane's own son, Robert Crane, testified against John. And Robert basically told the jury that his father had ended the friendship with John the night before the murder. But the trial had a huge problem, which was that most of the physical evidence was really old, and some of it had deteriorated, and the alleged brain tissue photo was disputed. And there was no murder weapon, and the actual blood evidence was inconclusive. And so after a long trial, in October of 1994, the jury acquitted John Henry Carpenter of all charges, and John walked out of the courthouse a free man. But even after the acquittal, the Scottsdale police still officially considered John Henry Carpenter the prime suspect. And they never opened another investigation into anyone else. And then 4 years after the trial, in September of 1998, John Henry Carpenter died of a heart attack in Torrance, California. And to this day, no one has ever been convicted of the murder of Bob Crane, and the case is officially unsolved. But Bob's son, Robert, has spoken about it a lot in interviews over the years. And he says he has no doubt in his mind who killed his father in that apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the early morning hours of June 29th, 1978. And to Robert, the fact that John Henry Carpenter walked out of that courtroom in 1994 as a free man and got to live out the rest of his life without ever being held responsible is the part of this whole story that has always been the hardest to accept.